and welcome to another evening of frank conversation here on Hard Copy, coming to you from our studios in Abuja. I'm Maupe Ogun Yusuf. Quite a potpourri of issues to deal with this week, from cybersecurity levy to politics. But first, let's deal with this issue. Last week, Press Freedom Day was celebrated to highlight the issues confronting journalists and the right of citizens all over the world, including Nigeria, to express themselves. This week, a number of civil society organizations and media houses have come together under a coalition called the Action Group on the Protection of Civic Actors. They say they are deeply concerned about the growing cases of attacks on press freedom and the flagrant abuse of due process and the rule of law by the Nigeria police. They cite the recent detention without prosecution of Mr. Daniel Ojukwu, a journalist with the Foundation for Investigative Journalists, FIJ. Now, this is coming on the heels of the detention of another journalist, Mr. Segun Olatunji, by military authorities, who only released him after an uproar by journalist bodies and civil society groups. Next month, Nigeria will celebrate her Democracy Day after President Bola Tinubu and other elected leaders mark their first year in office on the 29th of this month. Is our democracy really making progress? And how would we say this government has engaged with the civic space since it came into office a year ago? Majid Dahiru is a columnist and a technical team member of the Lux Terra Leadership Foundation and is my guest tonight. Welcome to Hard Copy.
Thank you very much for having me this evening.
Now, you would think that we have left all of these matters behind with military era and this was all done and dusted. But from time to time, we see issues like this. Whenever it is Press Freedom Day comes, we look at our ranking, it's not doing so well. And sometimes, even as a practitioner, I ask, why isn't this faring so well? But now, the instances are not even far-fetched. You don't have to look too hard before you begin to see, semblances of what will be making your country rank so low. Why is it so difficult to leave behind in our past the manner in which journalists are treated and even freedom of expression?
It's because some of the things we had to contend with during the military era are still very much here with us. And this can be couched in just one expression, and that is corruption.
Corruption? Failure
of leadership. And so the media's role, by implication, is to actually beam the searchlight in order to expose some of those dark corners in government and in other high places. And so there's always a pushback from those who are actually purveying and perpetrating these acts of corrupt practices in government. And so you shouldn't be surprised that the media sometimes becomes, a sacrificial lamb in the war on corruption. In Nigerian parlance, they say, when you fight corruption, it fights back. So there's a pushback. Those that are actually very much involved in corrupt practices have a tendency to hold the media in disdain, in contempt, and see them as just irritants that are trying to spoil business as usual for them. So don't be surprised that once in a while, you will see some of these acts of indiscretion, abuse of office, and all sorts of malpractices that are directed towards the media and media practitioners in Nigeria.
It's a little, well, maybe not surprising, but some people will say that, given the fact that part of what the president campaigned with when he was also asking Nigerian people for their votes was the fact that he was involved in the democracy struggles. As a result, one of the things we saw when President Buhari moved moved Democracy Day to June 12, we saw the current president, attend that particular ceremony as part of, those who struggled for this democracy.
Yes.
You would think that we would fare better under such an administration. It doesn't seem to be changing anything.
I think we're supposed to fare better. And if the president is not paying attention before now, the conversations around this year's freedom of speech commemoration should spur him to action, because he has the right democratic credentials, like you rightly pointed out. He was one of those who confronted the military and demanded for a return to civil democratic rule. And he's been a participant in Nigeria's democratic disposition of the Fourth Republic since 1999. And he's been in opposition for 16 years before his party, the APC, came to power in 2015. And so he benefited from a free media space that was relatively available to us as practitioners, even though it was always difficult, but at least due to pushbacks too from within the system, from within the media space, we were able to hold our ground since 1999. So I would expect that for something he benefited from, something that actually contributed to their own rise to power, because it was because of the freedom of speech, the freedom of media practice in Nigeria, that also helped them to express their misgivings, their criticisms of the former ruling establishment, which eventually led Nigerians that were convinced that we needed change by 2015, and they came to power. I would expect that he should deepen that ethos. He should make sure that he leaves Nigeria better than he met it in terms of press freedom and a liberal civic space.
Let me take you up on the issue of due process, because apparently they're not just concerned about the issue of press freedom, they're also concerned about the flagrant, what they term the flagrant abuse of due process and the rule of law, even though this is, according to them, by the Nigeria police under the current Inspector General. But this is something that has recently come up, this issue of due process and rule of law. Members of other political parties who are now in opposition are taking this government up on the issue of due process. And one of the places where they have taken it up, I do not know whether you've been following the conversations around the Lagos-Calabar coastal projects and the conversations that have been happening there. Yes, we've been seeing some engagement by the Minister of Works, Senator Dave Umahi, on that issue, but it doesn't appear that people are convinced that there is sufficient engagement with the people to justify why the work has, started, the speed behind the work, why this is a priority project, etc., etc. What are your thoughts on it? Especially when you have,
ongoing and sometimes abandoned projects amounting to trillions of naira and in thousands of kilometers of road infrastructure across the country. One would have expected that, given this armada of ongoing and abandoned projects, government would have prioritized completion of both ongoing and completed and the abandoned projects. And if you ask me, due to the paucity of funds that they actually talk about all the time, even a freeze on the award of new contracts would have made a lot of sense at this time. And so you now see a government awarding what they now call a coastal highway that seeks to link Lagos and about 8 other states to Cross River, Calabar specifically. And the way it's been implemented already, you see the destruction of business premises, the removal of ancestral communities along the shorelines, and the fact that many commentators have pointed out that this didn't really follow the due process of procurement as we know it in Nigeria. Now, it raises more questions than answers. But if you're a keen watcher of the political process in Nigeria, you will likely admit that corruption has remained an endemic problem that appears very intractable. And this is because since 1999, our political process has somewhat degenerated into, permit me to use the word, a criminal franchise of some sort that has substituted self-service, that has substituted public service with self-service. And so we are increasingly seeing government expenditure on projects that are not directly tied to the welfare and security of citizens and that are seen as really self-serving. I say this because the nature of our political process has thrown up patronage as the major reward system in place of good governance. And that is the conversation we should be having. Why is this so? And why does it appear as though corruption in Nigeria enjoys cultural legitimacy that makes it absolutely normal for government to do certain things and get away with it and get re-elected at every turn, at every electoral cycle, since 1999. So beyond just the symptoms that we see in the form of certain projects we think are not supposed to prioritize at this time, and the government going ahead with it stubbornly, we need to have a deeper conversation about what are the root causes of some of these problems we're battling with since 1999. Even when we transited from military to civil rule, they have not gotten better. They may have even gotten worse.
The question for me is, where is this conversation supposed to be happening? We would have thought that in a democracy, more and more of this sort of spaces, particularly in places like, say, the National Assembly, who are supposed to be representatives of the people, this sort of conversations is where we'll, it will spring from, maybe begin to trail down. Are there other spaces that you would like that kind of conversation to be going on at?
I think I agree with you when you talked about the National Assembly, because ordinarily you'll expect that members of the opposition that have been elected into the National Assembly are supposed to be the champions of alternatives to what we have today. But unfortunately, members of the opposition that were elected, particularly into the 10th Assembly, appear to have been given the kiss of death by the ruling party, and they have all gone numb. And so you see a lot of legislation come out of that chamber without a whimper from any member of the opposition party, including the Labour Party, the PDP, and other parties there. So to that extent, the political parties have failed in Nigeria. So while we are contending with failure of leadership on the part of ruling parties, we also have a bigger problem of failure of opposition on the part of opposition parties.
What if they argue that, look, it might be a situation of, it will be a case of majority will have their way and minority will have their say, that perhaps they have already spoken up on well, I don't know what example you're going to give us now, but that they can only speak. Nothing is going to get done. They might not be able to change the tide.
I don't have any example of when members of the opposition in the 10th Assembly have spoken up against some of the policies of this government that has created a lot of economic dislocations for Nigerians, ranging from first subsidy removal to the flotation of the national currency, to even the introduction of the levy, the 0.5% levy for cybersecurity to be domiciled in the office of the National Security Advisor, and all such, pronouncements and policies that the media have been holding the government account to say, look, this is not working for us, this is adding to our problems. I've not had a whimper from any member of either the Labour Party or the PDP in the parliament on some of these issues and concerns. So they're not even putting up a voice. They don't even have a say. Nobody expects them to have their way because they're in the minority. But when you have a say, it encourages Nigerians to think of how to consolidate further on our democracy by voting for more of opposition elements that seem to embody their concerns, that seems to show concern for their plight, their welfare and security, enough to get them into sufficient numbers that can make the right changes at the federal parliament. We've not seen that. So my fear is Nigerians might develop apathy towards even our democratic process. I might resign to fate because it will take more than just spoken words to arouse a serially jaded lover to interest into having a relationship with, a prospective suitor. So my fear is democracy is said to be dying in Africa. But it's not just the ruling parties that are actually responsible for that. I think the failure of opposition is even more responsible because whereas between 1999 and 2015, the PDP held sway. But we saw a very vibrant opposition in the then ACM and the CPC. Both parties were led by the current president and the former president, Muhammadu Buhari. And we saw vibrant opposition. We saw how they opposed subsidy removal by the PDP administration of Goodluck Jonathan. We saw how on every issue of governance, they provided an alternative point of view. And that was why Nigerians developed such interest, such resilience, as to pitch their tents with the opposition enough to defeat an incumbent government that has held the country for 16 years. But we're not seeing that today.
Well, some people will say, what exactly did they vote for? If they thought that one party was not doing well and then they decided to change and bring another party in and they're still not satisfied with what it is, is it really worth it at all? But before you answer that, because we're going to go on the break shortly, I want to just make a statement that this issue of cybersecurity levy, which we will dwell on a bit more, came up in the House of Representatives, and I think the Speaker persuaded members of the House that they should calm down and that they're going to engage in a robust conversation. This is now a matter of law. Is this something that because there'll be questions as to where were they when the law was passed?
Exactly, there was an amendment They were there when the amendment was being carried out. So what was their contribution in opposing that amendment that made provision for this additional levy on Nigerians that are already suffering?
So let's go back to this issue of voting. Would you really say, when you look at how democracy works, is it really the solution to the issues that border on the well-being and the quality of life that everyday Nigerians enjoy?
Yes. You see, democracy as a system of government is as good as any other system of government, as we have seen all over the world. But the case with Nigeria is that the way Nigeria is configured along ethnogeographic fault lines in terms of our federating unit and structure. You see, this unique structure has birthed identity politics that has mobilized Nigerians over time to align their democratic choices with their ethnicities and religion. And so Nigeria is a democracy. But what kind of a democracy do we have? It's a democracy that is focused on resource sharing and not on resource building. And that is something we need to tackle. So ordinarily we thought that after 24 years of democracy, this should have been identified. And a deliberate political process that will be backed by a purposeful administrative process by political parties. Because the political party system is the brain box of a democracy. Our political parties have just become mere platforms of negotiating power or grabbing power at all costs.
Yeah. For
the purpose of self-service.
But even that issue of identity politics, you know, along ethnic and sometimes religious lines, one would think that, oh, okay, if this group of people were in power, you know, it should favor a particular ethnic group. Maybe a particular ethnic group should be faring better. They should be, but that's not the case.
That is what Nigerians should realize. We don't seem to have realized that, and you need a political process, a deliberate one that will bring this realization to say, one, as Nigerians, apart from the fact that whatever ethnic group you identify with today as a Nigerian, we share a common cultural background, which makes us essentially one people. And so we shouldn't have this problem of deep divisions along ethnic and geographic fault lines. But you need a deliberate political process of a coalition of the willing, of the self-enlightened, that will come together and say we need to reset the foundation, the fundamentals of the Nigerian state.
That's back to constitution. That's back to restructuring.
That's why I use the word reconfiguration. There's nothing so wrong with our structure.
Let me take a completely different take on this. Let me look at it from those who will argue that, oh, okay, perhaps this conversation around democracy not working is because of the current economic hardships that people are going through. But that the economic hardships are inevitable, and that even in the countries where democracies have been stable, they are currently witnessing economic hardships. And that for some people, I mean, they will tell you that, oh, look, for the people who, when there is a problem, when there has already been many years of avoiding a particular problem or not dealing with it very squarely, that when the solutions eventually come, they will be very painful. They'll be very painful to implement, to the discomfort of all. So for those who argue from that perspective, would they also not have a point?
They do, but we also need to take that conversation a little bit deeper. Why is Nigeria struggling? Why have we been struggling over the years? It's simple. It's because as a country, we've not been able to evolve a national development agenda that keys into the global race for resources. What we've had in Nigeria is that because, again, we are a country of tribesmen, the focus has been internal struggle for Nigeria's internal resources, which, as God will have it, is generated mainly from about 2 million barrels per day oil money. And so there's been an over-focus on sharing and not building or baking a new national cake. And so the solution to our problem really starts with the fact that we first must evolve into a nation, a truly united nation of citizens that will be administered by the principles of equity, fairness, and justice to all, where the ethos of democratic citizenship is well entrenched. Now, this will bring about some level of social cohesion and national integration enough to now position Nigeria, like any other country that is prospering globally, to compete for global resources, because we're no longer competing for internal resources. And until you launch yourself into that competition for global resources, you cannot grow your wealth of a nation. So if you observe, in Nigeria's electoral process, you don't hear so much about foreign policy, because the focus is inward, is about whose turn it is to president, whose turn it is to get a ministerial appointment, whose turn it is to get the House of Reps seats. So you don't hear much about foreign policy because the focus is internal. Whereas if you look at major countries in the world, whether they're democratic or not, foreign policy engagement is a priority of every of such countries, because you know why? They've been able to resolve their internal contradictions enough to evolve a socially cohesive, nationally integrated, united nation states that are now competing globally. So whereas Nigeria today, for example, is still going all over the world asking for foreign direct investments, you have other countries that are actually going all over the world looking for where to invest. So ordinarily, if we are in that league, we should also be looking for overseas investment opportunities. But we're not in that league at all. So we are still looking for people that will come here and invest locally, when we should be looking outwards for opportunities to also invest and push Nigerian entities overseas. We don't have that at all. And so that is where we need to look towards to resolve this fundamental problem, without which we will keep taxing people to death in Nigeria because we're not productive enough. We don't have a sizable share of world resources. We're not even in the race for it yet. What is the volume of Nigeria's exports into the international market, for example? Because we are all feeding on rent accruable from oil exploration, and it is distributed across the federation. And so it has poured that contestation for power of control of these resources down the middle across this country. And so corrupt practices, let me emphasize again, corrupt practices like nepotism, favoritism, all forms of injustices are legitimate cultural tools to extract from this common pool to the sections of the country with those that are extracting as the major beneficiaries. And that's why in Nigeria, we've not been able to have any national consensus about national development.
Where do we start to build it from?
We are a democracy. So the responsibility falls on the political parties. You see, I was excited as a Nigerian in the build-up to the 2023 election and the results of that election. When we saw an organic movement of the non-initiates in the Nigerian political space, those that are outside of the establishment, and they ran around a figure called Mr. Peter Obi under the Obedient Movement banner. That for me was like a consolidation of democracy, because we saw people that were completely outside of the establishment, no governors, no parliamentarians, nothing. We saw for the first time where Nigerians contributed monies to fund their own political activities without waiting for any money back. And they identified a man whom they believed had the right level of integrity to lead Nigeria of today. And they went ahead to defy all odds and caused such a disruption, positive disruption in the polity, that they won Lagos, they won Abuja, along some other states. In fact, if you look at the results of the 2023 election, this resilience by the Nigerian people was so profound that each of the three leading candidates won 12 states apiece. And this party was powered by people power. That should have been the beginning of the consolidation of our democracy. But unfortunately, the major beneficiaries of this democratic change that we saw in 2023 appears to have betrayed this movement, because they've gone to the parliament and they have entered into an incestuous relationship with members of the establishment. They no longer speak for the people that braved the odds, that defied money rain to vote for them for free. As we speak today, the member representing our president in the Federal House of Reps is a member of the Labour Party. The last I heard of him was somebody defeated a very popular person like Bankole Wellington, and the APC candidate, Obanikoro, in that election. That was the last I heard of him. I've not heard him, for example, on the floor of the parliament, raise pertinent issues on behalf of the people that voted against an influential, a powerful figure, such as President Ahmed Bola Tinubu, right in his doorstep to get him elected.
Is it possible that, because of how the parliament also works, he's also been stifled?
You can't be stifled in parliament. You see, Bajabiamila was a parliamentarian since 2003. he would be remembered for his quality contribution on the floor that gave hope to Nigerians to say, look, maybe if we trust these people with power, maybe they can deliver.
Let me take you quickly up on this issue of cybersecurity levy. Some people will say, look, the next war front is going to be in the cyberspace. We need to be fortified, and I'm sure that's the reason why that fund, that levy was put there. Maybe it wasn't well thought out in terms of how much it should be, etc. But do you think that, this uproar is justified?
No, it is justified because Nigerians have had to put up with so much in recent times. Nigerians have become thoroughly impoverished because of the policies of this government that seems to be taken without giving much back to the people. But most importantly, I think from a strategic point of view, as it concerns an exalted office such as the National Security Advisor's Office, I do not think that that office should be exposed in terms of its revenue and expenditure streams. So yes, even if you want to do this to safeguard, to secure, to tighten security around our cyberspace and online ecosystem, you would have done it in a manner that did not put the Office of National Security Advisor in this public glare. Because when Nigerians begin to pay this fee or this levy, they will begin to hold that office to account for any breach of cybersecurity that they may experience. So you would have drawn that office that ordinarily supposed to operate behind the shadows into public discourse and bring it to disrepute. Because there's no guarantee, for instance, that this levy is going to put a final stop to cybersecurity challenges.
Mr. Majid Dahiru, thank you so much for coming on Hard Copy tonight.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's the program tonight, but we want to hear from you. So please send your thoughts and your feedback to the handles showing on your screen. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Maupe Ogun Yusuf. Good night.